Thank you, Peter, for that wonderful introduction. Again, my name is Lone. I will be moderating our panel this morning on state violence as an environmental justice issue. And first, I just wanted to go ahead and introduce our panelists who have joined us. To my immediate right is Dee Dee Jackson. She's from Philadelphia by way of Miami. She's one of the founders of the Florida International University chapter of Dream Defenders in Miami, and she is currently a Triangle Field Organizer with Ignite NC. Thanks for joining us, Dee Dee. And then next to Dee Dee is Adam Bledsoe. I'm just going to read his bio that's in this packet here. He's a PhD candidate in the Geography Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His dissertation research focuses on Black communities in Bahia, Brazil, that are attempting to defend their territories against a number of private and publicly sponsored land grabs. And I know he has a presentation to share with us this morning. And then, of course, last but not least, Saladin Muhammad. He's a founding member of Black Workers for Justice and is a retired international representative of the United Electrical Workers Union and lead organizer in the forming of the NC Public Service Workers Union, UE Local 150. He's also a co-coordinator of Southern Workers Assembly and a Moral Monday arrestee. So we have a really powerful group of people here this morning, so if we can just go ahead and give them a round of applause. Awesome. I will be moderating this conversation this morning. All of our speakers are going to have about 12 minutes, which is very precise, but I understand that we are tight on time, so I'll make sure that we go through that. And then we'll open it up for question and answer, whether it be between the panelists or between the audience and our panel, and then we'll have some closing remarks. First, before we got started, I just wanted to offer a sort of framing for this conversation, right? Because our panelists are going to be talking a lot about some about the Squatter Prison Pipeline, about Black Lives Matter, about the land grabs that I mentioned from Adam's biography, and about Hurricane Katrina, right? And so, these are really, these are events, these are issues, these are topics that come up in our everyday lives. And so I just wanted to sort of get folks thinking now, right? What do we think of when we think state violence? What does that mean, right? And what comes to mind when we think about the intersections of state violence and environmental justice issues? And in my mind, there are some very concrete, both recent and historical examples of that. Just yesterday, many of us heard from local Eastern Carolina communities about these CAFOs, about these hog farms. We heard from the Snow Hill community, for example, that they don't have any water, right? Because the state, which encompasses local government, elected officials, federal agencies, are allowing for a landfill to be built on stolen land, right? This land has been in their community and their families for a very long time, right? But is sort of just being thrown away. In 2014, we witnessed the Black suburb of Ferguson, Missouri, take the streets after a 17-year-old Mike Brown was ruthlessly murdered, right, and left in the streets. And Ferguson is only 12 miles away from St. Louis. The population is about 21,000 people. Yet in 2013, they issued over 30,000 arrest warrants, right? You have 10,000 more arrest warrants than you have actual people in this suburb. And in moments of crisis, Ferguson residents were met with militarized police and tear gas as the police sought to protect property instead of people. And then even further back in history, during the war in Vietnam, the United States used Agent Orange as a part of its warfare program, right? And this herbicide not only killed crops, decimated land, and polluted waters, 30 years later, adults and children are still living with the toxic effects of this herbicide, right? People are chronically ill, people are disabled, right? Children are still being born at this time facing these toxic, harmful effects, right? And so I offer these examples to encourage us to think about state violence at home and abroad, right? And that for many of us, the reality is that it is both police brutality and imperialist wars, right? It is low-wage jobs here and sweatshops in other parts of the world. And it is undeniably linked to environmental injustice, right? They are accomplices and they reinforce each other. And so in order for us to think about how we can win facing these big questions, we have to identify the shared logic, right? And that is, under this system, there are bodies that are seen as disposable, right? And there are already thousands of bodies that have been disposed of, right? And that there are people who are worthy of being denied access to basic human needs, such as clean water, clean air, housing. And so as our panelists speak today, please make sure to take some notes if you can. If you have any questions, make sure to write them down, because I think this is going to be a really powerful and important conversation to start off today. So Dee Dee, take us away.
Hi everyone. Can we first give a round of applause for Lone for an amazing. Okay, I'm gonna try to hold this very creative mic stand up. So like Lone said, my name is Dee Dee, originally from Philadelphia, born and raised. And while I was living in Philadelphia, I lived in a predominantly Black, poor and working class neighborhood, in which means that I also attended very under-resourced, underfunded schools through K through 12. My high school was very similar to, in aesthetics, to a prison or a juvenile detention center. And so walking into high school, there's a 30-minute wait outside so that they can set up the metal detectors and the ID scanners to get in. So you're walking into an environment where this actual school police, which are actual police officers and not just a company or that is contracted in, but actual police officers that are hired to patrol the school, have you go through a metal detector, wand you every day that you come into school. There was bars on the windows, chains on the doors kind of school. And so that environment creates a certain type of feeling while you're there, and a certain type of education that you're meant to learn. And so it's very, what's in the book is what is the truth, and what I say is also what is the truth. And if you can't abide by those rules, then we have places for you to go other than this school. So it was very much lots of issues, microaggressions that happened in this school, but issues specific to the Black community and very reflective of what was going on in the environment of this area of Philadelphia that I was living in. And so the school to prison pipeline doesn't just happen at schools where there's a small percentage of Black students that are attending, and they're the ones that are being targeted and pushed out and suspended from the schools, but also at a very much higher rate at the predominantly Black schools. And so in going to these schools, the only way for self-preservation was to go to college and get a degree and get a job in that same old narrative. And so I went to Cheyney University of Pennsylvania, which is the oldest historically Black institution for higher learning. And I went there and I got my bachelor's in recreation and sport management. And I decided to go there and specifically study recreation because at this particular school, going to the HBCU and studying recreation meant centering community. It meant talking about community recreation and not just sports, but talking about and learning about the things that people do that make them happy. And so that's what I decided to study, and was really involved in the community at my school. I was an athlete and a dancer and on a number of other organizations. And so after undergrad, I then went on to grad school, also studying recreation and sports management at Florida International University. And while I was there, I would attend the Black Student Union meetings. This school is a predominantly Latinx school, and so I would attend the Black Student Union meetings and met some folks that were part of an organization called the Dream Defenders. And the Dream Defenders is an all Black and brown youth-led organization in Florida that particularly works on the school-to-prison pipeline, racial profiling, and mass incarceration. And in particular at this time was doing work around the stand your ground laws, trying to get the stand your ground laws repealed for the most part. And so doing student organizing and trying to build this chapter on this campus that talks about racial profiling and mass incarceration and all these things was difficult, just like all student organizing is. But it was a good foundation for myself to start and being a part of something that was monumental and historical and had never been done in the state of Florida. After I graduated, I couldn't afford to live in Miami because it's Miami. And so I decided to move to Durham. I have a grandmother that lives there. I have a lot of family. I come from 5 or 6 generations of North Carolina family. And so in moving here, I got connected to other folks that were organizing, doing student organizing, and became a field organizer for an organization called North Carolina Student Power Union that specifically works around college affordability and accessibility. But you realize in doing this work and trying to stay grounded in the root of the issue, that it's much, much bigger than college affordability, and it's much, much bigger than college accessibility, and that there are so many micro aggressions that happen on the campuses of the state of North Carolina and throughout the state of North Carolina that need to be addressed. And it's different because in this state in particular, because North Carolina has the most historically Black colleges, and more than any other state in the country. And so there are particular issues that happen on HBCUs that are not only different from the predominantly white institutions, but also different depending on if the school is public or if it's private. And so I'm sure these are all like things that you all know about, but and experiences in these things and the uproar and this call for Black Lives Matter that has been so prevalent in our everyday lives. It is tackling those issues that happen on the micro level, that happen in the classrooms, that happen with campus administration, and with campus police. And so a lot of the push that has been happening statewide is around these Confederate monuments and statues or buildings named after KKK members and Grand Dragons and Confederate soldiers. And so this has been at UNC. We've seen it at ECU, also at and also, okay, no, she's good. And students at North Carolina Central University have also been talking about getting a building name change. And so it's dealing with these visible affirmings of white supremacy and of capitalism that are on these college campuses. These are public institutions. And that they are uplifting, and not only uplifting, but also protecting, visibly and aggressively protecting these Confederate monuments and statues. And so we know that it doesn't just start or stop with these Confederate statues, because once we tackle these, then we know the next thing is the banks and everything else that contributes to white supremacy in this country, and they know that that's what's next. And so the protection of these things have come with that. They don't want us to uproot white supremacy and capitalism and imperialism in this country. And so and as the growth of support for Black Lives Matter increases, the opposition also increases. And that has happened historically in movements. Whenever you see a growing support for something, the opposition also grows. And that is what contributes to this heightened visibility of racism and white supremacy. And so, yeah, I wanted to add that into the space, and also encourage folks, and not to say that folks have not already been doing this, but I work specifically with students, and these are the issues that they face on an everyday basis, and in a school that they pay to go to, and not to go into another conversation about how much they pay to go to these schools and why that is, which is also another conversation folks can feel free to come to me to talk about. But to actually always thinking from a framework of the roots of it being imperialism and white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy. And I can go on and on, right? But thank you for having me.
Good morning, everyone. This on? Good morning. So, got to get close. My name is Adam Bledsoe. I am a PhD candidate. I'm in my 6th year at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And yeah, that's good. Thanks. All right, good. Okay, so I'm originally from Minneapolis, in North Carolina for school, obviously. I'm really excited to be here and be able to kind of share some of the work I've done abroad in Brazil, and kind of link up conversations going on domestically here in the United States and in North Carolina, and also in Brazil, in Bahia, where I do my work and where I've spent a significant amount of time for the past 8 years or so. Well, I guess I'll start by saying that one of the only things that the people that I work with have really asked of me in a lot of ways is that I share their story, that I am able to translate and share their story to the people I come across in the United States. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that here today. Just to give a little bit of background about the community that I'm going to be talking about today, this is a community called Rio dos Macacos. And it is in Bahia. It has about a 200-year history, more or less, might even be longer than that. The people who live there today can trace their lineage all the way back to slaves who worked on plantations in the area. Currently, there's only about 25 families living in this community. Previous to this, there were over 70. I'll kind of go over what happened there. And see, there's a long history going back to the environmental issue of foraging, subsistence farming, and fishing being very important to the communities. And I suppose I'll start with kind of the caveat that in this talk, what I'm going to be arguing is that even in situations where the state purports to be helping communities, often they work to the detriment of the community. Legislation that is supposedly progressive, supposedly helpful to these communities often ends up being another form of violence. So, just to give everybody an idea about where it is I'm talking about, this is the state of Bahia, right there. It's in the northeast of the country. The northeast of the country has a long history of chattel slavery, sugarcane farming, cotton production. To get more specific, the area that I'm talking about is in this right around here. It's in an area called Aratu. The Bay of Aratu is the name. And to get even more specific, the community itself is located right in here. This is a dam that provides energy for the Brazilian Navy, who is one of the grand antagonists in this story that I'll be telling today. And the community itself exists right around that area, around the dam. So just to give you an idea, to go back, this region of the state of Bahia is one that has a long history of plantations, of farming. And when you get outside kind of the metropolitan area of Salvador, Salvador is the third biggest city in the country. When you get outside of there, you start to kind of see the legacies of slavery, the legacies of kind of this built environment of plantations. Many of the communities there, while obviously not slaves anymore, have a relation to the land where they, do some subsistence farming, where they do fish. And there's significantly less infrastructure in this part of the state as well. Not as much, there's often places that don't have electricity, running water, things like that. So the origins of this community go back to I'd say the early to mid 19th century, when the community members' ancestors or grandparents, in many cases, grandparents and parents, were brought to work the land. And this continued until, obviously, abolition. 1888 is the date of abolition in Brazil. But the farming practices continued, and the landowners who were slave owners continued to be in power in the area. And that lasted until roughly around World War II, when shifting agricultural practices, personal issues around some of these landowners changed, and many of them left their former slaves and their progeny there in the area while they moved to more urban areas. And this is kind of where the autonomous practices, the autonomous existence of this community comes from. It comes from basically being left to their own devices. So foraging, things like honey collection, the harvesting of wild fruits, vegetables, tubers, things like that is very big in this area. As I mentioned before, the fishing of the local rivers. This is obviously close to the coast. That's the Atlantic Ocean. Fishing was a big thing, and then actual cultivation, plant cultivation of things like corn, beans, squashes, things like that were very big for the community. Things began to change around the time of World War II, 1940-ish, 1944, I think is the year, if I'm remembering correctly, when the American military actually arrived and built an air base there for their military. And after World War II was over, they turned it over to the Brazilian military. From around 1949 until 1960, around the 1960s, the naval presence in the area, the Brazilian naval presence in the area was fortified. And so the base was expanded on. This is a picture of the base right here. A dam was built to provide energy to the base. And maybe, I wouldn't say most importantly, but for the purposes of this story, another very important event was the building of a naval villa for the officers and the soldiers to live in. And around this community that I'm talking about, Rio dos Macacos. And so basically what you have is kind of a fortified enclave of privilege of these soldiers and officers that are built around subsistence and autonomous community, organized around kind of its own subsistence practices. And basically from the beginning of the Navy's interaction with this community, you see forms of state violence and exploitation. So, the community members were made to work for free, essentially. The young men, children in some cases, worked on the construction of the naval base. They worked on the construction of the villa, of the dam. Were never paid for any of it. The women worked domestically, cooking and cleaning, washing clothes, acting as midwives to the officers' wives and spouses, never getting paid for any of it. The eldest member of the community right now is almost 100 years old, and every time I talk with her, she tells me about how, she always says, they don't have a heart, these people don't have a heart. I basically broke myself working for them my entire life from the time she was, a young woman, and I never had anything to show for it. I've never had anything to show for it. And so, on top of this kind of continuation of slavery, of slave practices, you also had very brutal, very direct forms of violence, beginning in the late 1970s and 1980s, of basically trying to expel these people from their land. Assassination attempts, members have been shot, their subsistence practices have essentially been destroyed. The soldiers will come and rip their fields up when they try to plant. The burning down of houses, arson is another thing that has happened to them. The rape of several women in the community has happened. And so in the 1980s, you have basically a mass exodus of many of the families from the area. And it goes from around 70 families to only now about 25. And I think, I would say probably the thing that has, in addition, all of these things are awful, but one of the things that people constantly talk about is how different it is now that they're not able to plant, that they're not able to fish. There was, around the same time that the Navy was kind of settling itself in this area, industry began to come into the area, the pollution of rivers occurred, so that many of these rivers are not habitable for fish or any kind of marine life. And from a community that used to be able to provide for itself completely, there's this issue now of hunger, of malnutrition, lack of education. Often the Navy wouldn't let the children leave the area. They would physically prevent them from leaving to go to school. So there's actually quite a high level of illiteracy as well in the community. And this is not to say that these forms of violence were just in the 1980s. I mean, I was there for most of 2014. And the first day that I got there, this occurred. This was early January 2014. The community is forced to build makeshift houses because the Navy will stop them at their checkpoints if they come in with cement, bricks, things like that to actually build more permanent establishments. The Navy will keep them from doing that. And so what you basically have are kind of these makeshift houses that they've been forced to build that are more or less adobe houses. These are basically mud bricks and kind of a wooden lattice framework that the houses are built out of. And the Navy, the soldiers will come and tear the houses down. And this occurred last year, almost 2 years ago now. And just a couple months ago, a young man from the community was on his way back home and was basically jumped by a group of soldiers. It was beat up. Obviously you see the stitches in his head there. And so all that to say that these violent actions are not a thing of the past. This is not something that happened once and is a thing that, things of yesteryear. These are still going on. And so the forms of resistance that the community has kind of put forward are multiple. There's often kind of civil disobedience, I would say. They'll sometimes block kind of the entrance to the naval villa so that the soldiers and officers can't come and go. Just kind of, try to show them what it's like to be obstructed, have your daily lives obstructed. They're constantly in communication with the federal government in Brasilia to try and get attention paid to this. The President Dilma, who's the president of the republic right now, vacations right nearby here. She's very aware of what's going on in this situation and has made no public pronouncement on it. But one of the measures, these maps are kind of hard to read, but I'll explain them. One of the things that they've really been trying to do is use legislation that was included in the 1988 Constitution to get their land titled and thereby legally protected. Now, this is a really long, kind of complicated process that I'm not going to go into all the details here, but essentially there's two parts to this territorial certification where you get culturally certified as a traditional community, a community that practices, has unique cultural practices, unique religious practices, productive practices, and then you actually have to have the government come and do a diagnostic on how much land the government believes that you need, because of course the government knows better than everybody else in this situation. So this process has been going on since about 2012, and every single proposal that the government has come forward to this community with would basically mean the end of the community. It's cutting down on over, I'd say almost 70% of the land that they currently have, and it's kind of the community has come to an impasse. So this is the first proposal, and what they were proposing, it's hard to see, but this is the wall that separates the naval villa and therefore the community from kind of the outside. They were proposing to settle them in a group of apartment complexes outside of their traditional land. Because if you're an autonomous subsistence community, you'd love to live in an apartment complex where you have never lived for the past 200 years. The next two proposals came as a resettlement. They offered them in the second proposal a small parcel of land, a small strip of land where they live now, but it meant the relocation of almost all the families that are left there. Now, I suppose I should say that part of the claims that this community is making is that they want all of the families that were expelled to be able to come back as well. They want a return, and the families that have been moved and have been forced to move also want to come back. So that's also a large part of the claims and struggles of this community. So that was the small parcel of land in the resettlement was the second proposal. That was rejected. They then combined the first two proposals into an outside set of apartment buildings as well as a small strip. That was rejected. In 2014, I believe it was March of 2014, a new proposal was offered, and this would be the habitable area. Now that looks big on the map, but it actually is less than a fourth of what their land has historically been, and what they live on now. And it would also have meant the resettlement of the oldest family, the family that's lived the longest in the area. And so that was rejected. Now, unfortunately, I'm sorry, this should read fourth. I don't have the fifth proposal that the government came back with, but it was slightly more than this. However, it still meant, a significant cutting down of the community's land, and it settled them on parts of their territory that are basically unable to be cultivated. So they wouldn't be able to continue their planting practices there. And so they've rejected that, and they came back with a counter proposal that basically allows them to stay in all of the land that they've lived in. So all of this, all of this area as well, while giving the Navy a buffer to the dam. Because the big thing that the Navy's keeps coming back with is, we can't let you have the land that you live on now because you would have access to the dam, and that's an issue of national security. As if they're some kind of terrorist or something. I mean, it's ridiculous. The dam is an area that they've fished in for several years after it was built, before all this ridiculous, crazy violence started to happen. So they're kind of at an impasse now, and the government has basically said to them, we're going to go forward with titling the land and planting it, and you guys can either accept that, or we can just go back to square one, and we can keep letting the Navy abuse you the way that it has. And so I was there just this past summer. I came back in August, and nothing has been resolved. They're basically kind of at this standstill. It's unclear as to what is going to happen next. So the current situation is kind of, as I said, at an impasse. One of the things that the community is kind of hoping for is some kind of international oversight, international presence. This is from an event from 2014 in which the United Nations special, what does it say there? It was like a special committee on adequate housing, and they were going around Salvador and kind of doing surveys of people who were living in precarious settlements, and they went to this community to heal those macacos. Nothing has yet come of that either, but the community itself is linked up with many of the other kind of traditional communities in the area, and they organize protests together. As I said, civil disobedience. But I think for the purposes of this panel, I think it's important that we understand what's going on abroad. It's not always clear how these connections can be organized across, and what we could do for people over there. But I think dialoguing about it is a necessary first step. And I guess I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Saladin.
Good morning. Well, it's also good to be on a panel with a generation that will have a longer time to carry out the plans for change. It's very good to be on that generation. Some of us have ideas and we can make contributions, but the long-term strategy requires others who we hope can't know these days because the police are killing them all off, but that we hope will be around. Let me start off by saying that I think we have to recognize that oppression itself is a condition of violence. Oppression is a condition of violence. It's a condition of socioeconomic, political, cultural, state and racist violence. Violence against women, violence against people with different gender orientations. It's a condition of violence. And it's very, very important to understand that the communities and the people that we are talking about are oppressed communities, oppressed people. They're not just citizens somehow overlooked, because of the big bureaucracy and all of the responsibilities of this big government. It's a condition of oppression which serves this economy. When we think about the state, which is the government, and we use that term, and sometimes it doesn't make clear that we're talking about all segments of the government. So when we talk about state oppression and we don't talk about the government, we really don't understand the role of the government and how it commits violence against oppressed people in every way. Hearing the comrades speak about police in the schools, is an expression of that. When struggling against environmental injustices, it's important to understand the expansive character and role of the state, of state violence, so we can create effective strategies, tactics, and coalitions to struggle against the corporate-driven state violence committed against working class and poor communities and people on a daily basis. Now, it's important to understand that the state, the government, is not a neutral element. Sometimes we think it's neutral. You can, vote on, people and this and that. But we also here talking about, how corporations control elections, the Koch brothers and these kinds of things, and the politicians and the lobbyists, etc. That should tell us that there's a class that really controls the government. So when we think about the policies of the state, we're thinking about corporate-driven policies. Policies that are designed to oppress, exploit, and maximize profit off of our oppression. So it's important that we understand that when we think about our communities and we think about the struggle against environmental justice. I want to, draw some examples by talking a little bit about Hurricane Katrina and the role of the state. I had the assistance of my granddaughter here, and she abandoned me. Thank you. Thank you. When we talk about Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Katrina triggered the disaster. It really wasn't responsible for the greatest disaster that affected the people in the Gulf Coast and particularly New Orleans. It was the government, it was the state, driven by corporate policies that forced people out of public housing that was still livable, had police to stop people from re-entering housing, making them homeless, or pushing them into the Superdome, kind of real decaying situation. There was hundreds of school buses in the parking lot that was not used to transport people out of the situation. All of this is government controlled. The railroads would not pick up the people to rush them out. So the corporate response and the government response was not in the interest of the people. We have to be clear about this. When we appeal to the state for remedies of our problems, that they are going to find a way to discourage us, to restrict us, or to minimize what the state and the corporate sector has to do to respond. Leading up to Katrina, years before, the state, all levels of government knew about the unstable levees. They knew about it. They didn't provide adequate funding to repair those levees. So that means that the state made people in New Orleans, particularly in the lower land areas, and if we look throughout North Carolina and other places, we will find that's where, large concentrations of black people, people of color, poor people live, because even where people lived in the development of this society made sure that those who were the most vulnerable to natural disasters, etc., were those who were oppressed from the very, very, very beginning. So we have to look at our conditions and understand that these conditions are tied to a history of oppression. And any improvement of our conditions has really come as a result of a struggle, of a fight. And we haven't changed the system, but any improvement, it has come not because of our verbal appeals, but because we've struggled along with the verbal demands as opposed to verbal appeals. The response of the federal government was almost a week. People drowning, dying, and these kinds of things. This is the government now. So when the government don't respond, for a week, it tells you how the state will leave you in a situation in order to be violently affected, impacted by natural disasters. Well, we should also understand that the response of the government was dictated by the strategies of the corporate powers. They wanted to dismantle these communities. They wanted to drive people out. They also wanted to be able to reap profits off of the destruction of the people. Katrina began to popularize a term called disaster capitalism. They popularized that. That is, that communities who are vulnerable, who are underdeveloped, and who can be greatly impacted by environmental injustice, ecological injustices, are very, very profitable. Billions of dollars was put into New Orleans, supposedly, to deal with recovery and reconstruction. President Bush could have been Obama. He suspended what's called the Davis-Bacon Act. This is an act that was established in 1931 that said that workers on public projects, largely in construction, must be paid the prevailing wage. The prevailing wage is largely been set by the union sector, and it benefits any workers who work on public projects. For almost 2 months, that Davis-Bacon Act by the government was suspended. It was suspended knowing that that these employers, these companies would be able to maximize the surplus, the profits out of exploiting this labor. They understood that the immigration would bring workers largely from throughout the Americas into New Orleans. Was about 20,000 that came in the first 10 days after Katrina to do work. The Davis-Bacon Act just, allowed, them to just be drained of their labor. And many of them weren't even paid. In fact, land was rented out to people to sleep in tents for prices that you would pay to live in an apartment. This is, in the state, allowed this to happen. So it's very important for us to have an understanding of this. The police was sent out not to rescue people, but to protect private property. The police stopped people from trying to go to higher ground. If you remember, the cops was shooting at people on the bridge, stopping them from coming in. This is the role of the state. Now, as the brother talked about internationally, most of the pumps and other kind of emergency material was in Iraq. And the National Guards, who's supposed to be available to respond to these, most of them were in Iraq somewhere fighting an imperialist war. So even their basic function, not just to militarily defend, but to help to defend against natural disasters and emergencies, the majority of them were not around because they were fighting a war somewhere. So it's really important to really understand what we're up against. Now, the Angola prison in New Orleans flooded. Many people died in that situation. This is the state, the prison industrial complex. When people went to Jenna in order to move out of New Orleans, people were attacked over there. I remember when I was down in New Orleans and people were fleeing, the newspaper said that the worst riffraff from New Orleans in the Gulf is going to be coming into your cities. The dope pushers, the robbers, the thieves, the same things that they're saying about immigrants coming into this country. And people who were dispersed were attacked in some of these cities. The role of the state did not act in the interest of the people. Now, when we look at the recovery issue, since 2008, the state of Louisiana has provided incentives in the amount of $11.1 billion to the corporations. $11.1 billion to the corporations. Their budget their operating budget over the same period was cut by $673 million. So we're seeing why the recovery of the people, we're seeing why the thousands of people can't return back to New Orleans and back to the Gulf. Again, the state is not using its resources to help to address the lives of the people. Now, it takes a struggle. You got a reactionary a mayor general in New Orleans not thinking about the recovery for the people, but thinking again how to maximize profits, you know, for the corporations. If you remember that New Orleans, Alabama, and Georgia were three of the states that refused money from the federal government to develop what they call the most depressed areas. Now you had New Orleans refusing money that was aimed at addressing the most depressed areas, which would have been those areas hardest hit by Katrina. So I say this and you know would stop and you know entertain as a part of the panel you know questions. But what does this mean for our struggle here? You know, what confidence can we have in the state? We heard at the listening panel even some good people saying, I can't do this, I don't have no authority to do that, I can't, you know, go, et cetera, et cetera. This is what they're saying. However, history has also shown that these bureaucratic restrictions are forced, have to be forced by the organized actions of the people. And this is what our movement here has yet to do. And this is not a criticism. This is an assessment of where we are. You know, there's a term that some leftists, revolutionaries, and even just anybody with good sense is using. And that is saying that this system, this capitalist system, is doing so much wrong that it's leading toward barbarism. Leading toward barbarism, where we will do anything to survive. Where the so-called humanity and the morality of this system will let people die, won't extend Medicaid, will try to control the body of women, that it is moving toward barbarism. And so when we think, and you know, including destroying the earth. And so when we have a real sense of what direction this society, this system is going into, and how many of us, how many more of us will have to die because of its direction, then we must begin to look at our struggle against environmental racism, because that dictates who will probably die first, opening up the floodgates for millions more people to die, then we will have to develop strategies and tactics to take stronger actions. In order to save my life, I must be prepared to go to jail if necessary. You know, in order to save my life, I must be prepared to lose some sleep if necessary. In order to save my life, I must be prepared to form coalitions with others in order to increase the power to be able to fight back. We have to think about the state, how it carries out its role in oppressing our communities, in discouraging our people, in killing our people. And if those of us who are 50 and over, I'm 70, are talking about the next generation, then if we care really, 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 and really about the next generations, then we are going to have to be prepared to make some sacrifices to challenge this state, this corporate-driven state, so that the legacy for our children will be one of struggle, you know, with a vision of a new kind of world for people. So I want to close on that, and hopefully we can, you know, look at what our tactics must be in our discussions, you know, in order to empower us, you know, to struggle for environmental justice.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing such powerful and amazing things. And I think that, you know, the question that Saladin poses for all of us is a really good one, right? What are our tactics? What are our strategies for actualizing, you know, the visions that we have for our communities and for our world? And so the time is now 9:53. This panel goes until 10:15. And so we have about 20 minutes or so for question and answer. And so I will go ahead and open up the floor for folks. And the panelists are also welcome to ask each other questions. Anyone else want to go ahead and raise your hand now if you have a question, and I'll take staff. Awesome. 1, 2, go ahead.
I want to make a comment. A couple of years ago, I want to make a comment. Years ago, I was reading an article from the, I'm going to give them the,
You might have to hand up, man.
okay.
If you could come to the mic now.
Or can't use this mic.
Or can we give her?
I want to do
You can pull that one off the stand. It's only got about 5 feet of cord, so if she walks this way, it'll be better because the plug-in is over here.
I just want to make a statement, a comment, and it was in regards to the young lady Dee Dee. A couple of years ago, I read a National Education Association magazine, and I was shocked. I was just looking through the magazine, and in it, it had made a statement that said that every black child, not every, most black children that are born today, when they enter preschool, some of them are already ordained for prison. That blew my mind. And the article went on to say that when they see the little child acting up, instead of doing some good intervention, they want to punish him right away. So the child learns punishment early. It was just mind-blowing. So we need to think about how people are, like Saladin said, strategizing us, conditioning us through our children. That's all I can say.
Hey, I'm Elizabeth from the Center for Civil Rights, and I'm wondering if you can talk about boycott as a strategy. I mean, we know the Montgomery bus boycott solved some issues, and I'm thinking about a Smithfield boycott. What has that been tried yet? What do we need to do if it's determined by the organizers to be a tactic with potential? What do we need to do to make that happen?
Well,
Before he speaks, can I just say one thing that might be of importance to what Elizabeth just said? And that is Smithfield was the owner of all these animals in North Carolina, and they sold out to this Chinese company called the W8 Group. So it might be more difficult to identify their products in the market, but we could certainly find out how to best do that if we decide to go that route. So.
Other questions? 1, 2 back there, and then 3. You can go ahead.
I have a question and a statement. First is that I want to thank Brother Saladin for pointing out this whole future that we're looking forward to. But I would submit that we actually have barbarism now. Okay, we're at a stage in which people become immune to violence. You watch on TV, you watch on media, everything. The policing of the school, I mean, parents should be up there protesting. How come your school has got chains and locks? You think our kids are prisoners when they go to school each time? So we actually have some form of barbarism right now. So we have to recognize that. Look at the people's response to the refugees, right? The killing of the immigrants from Mexico every day. So in that sense, we become immune, so let us not become immune. Let's regain our humanity in some way, shape, or form. Because this is really bad, because we're already in the stages of barbarism. And in fact, it's so bad that the environmentalists have proposed a term for this epoch. They call it the Anthropocene epoch, where humans actually change the age significantly enough for it to become a different epoch. So I'm just saying it's something that we should really listen very carefully to the message that's put out by Brother Saladin, that it's our responsibility. We have a social responsibility to change things, and we got to do that. So that's my statement. The second thing I wanted to point out is a question. There's this myth of corporate, that we got to get the corporations here because they're providing jobs. All right, so it's something that we got to think about how to bust that myth, because it actually happened in Rocky Mount here, where there's this, I think there was a chicken plant that was proposed, and there were communities that was against it because of the environmental impact, and then there were communities that said, oh, we gotta have it because we need the jobs. All right, so I think that we really gotta bust this myth that we bring corporations in to provide jobs, because this is what the Chamber of Commerce is promoting, and if you go to any even somewhat progressive meeting, this is what they're going to say. Oh, we can't do that because we need these corporations to provide jobs. So we need to combat that myth about how we can work around that in terms of providing it for our own survival.
The person all the way in the back with the hands up. Go ahead.
My name is Louis Jones, European community, but I would like to say something here that's proud of me. Maybe anger a lot of people. I don't know. If you give me 1 minute, I would like to pose this question.
Mr. Dozy, can you come up front to the mic so we can hear you better?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was listening to Brother Muhammad making a comment there, and it reminded me of something that I've known since I can remember. You say you're 70, but my next birthday I'll be 80. The greatest weapon, now this statement, this term I'm going to use here may may upset some people, but the greatest weapon that the Caucasian capitalism has against us, do you understand what I'm saying there? Is that they have a buffer of poor white people between them and us. I've known it since I was 5 years old, and I started remembering when Pearl Harbor was bombed. Somehow, and I'm just proposing this as a question, a suggestion, how can we get poor and desperate white people who are suffering in many cases more than just as much as anyone else to forget about the white thing, the racial thing, and realize survival and how we can move in that direction. This is what I'm proposing. That is what they're holding against us. There are a large number of poor white people, and as long as they can convince them that because they're white, they should be against everybody else, we're not going to be able to really do it. If we could get to them and get rid of this color thing, or get them to realize something because they're white, they're not going to survive either unless they join the human movement. I would propose that we start trying to see what we can do to get that in motion. Thank you very much.
So we've taken up a few questions already, and so I want to bring that back to the panelists, and just to summarize some of the questions that have been asked, and then we'll answer those and keep taking questions, so remember your questions. But one of the early questions was boycott as a tactic at this moment in time, right? And also, which also has some relationship with how do we combat this myth that we need corporations in our communities, right? How do we combat this idea that corporations are bringing jobs and bringing salvation, right, to working class people? And then the most recent question that was brought up, right, was this question of solidarity, right? How do we build solidarity as working people, as people of color, as black and brown folks with poor white people who are very much so attached to this idea that whiteness is going to protect them, right? So those are sort of the three questions, and there's no particular order that we have to go in. So go ahead.
Well, I think the world market that Smithfield, particularly in terms of hogs and also they got chickens and everything else too. A boycott, could take an international character. How we define the impacts from these CAFOs, impacts that are not just framed to appeal to legislators, because sometimes we frame them, in order to, for the legislators to try to, make some small moves on it. But I think we have to begin to, if we're calling for a boycott, another level of direct struggle has to first be shown. You don't call for a boycott and say, well, what have you done? Well, I'll just sit back, you understand, for years just talking to legislators, now we need a boycott. No, it's gotta be a struggle. And you call for a boycott, out of a struggle. So again, understanding tactics, we have to be more engaged in order to draw greater attention and greater solidarity to our effort here. I think that's basic. Now we can do that. I remember the 52-hour action at the legislature. That was important, but they didn't. You extend the moratorium, but they took no no direct actions there. We got to take direct action there and force the legislature to have to deal with how they're going to deal with people who are using their bodies to defend their lives. See, that we have to force another discussion there. And then we need to call, you know, for a national boycott, an international boycott, and to draw on allies to do that. I think that would be very, 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 very important. And that helps to draw out the struggle against the corporations. And it helps also to expose, you know, the government and where is it going to stand on a life and death question here, which was a weakness in how we responded to Hurricane Katrina, in my view. Hurricane Katrina, for example, and rightly so in many ways, you know, there was a humanitarian response, you know, of food and everything else. That was very, very, very important. But the political response, you know, to challenge what was happening, we didn't do that. The humanitarian response was important. But, you know, Cuba tried to send, you know, 1,600, you know, medical workers and tons of medical supplies, and that humanitarian response was not accepted. You know, Venezuela tried to send all kinds of aid over, and that was not accepted by the government. You can't help to save the people. You can't do this, you can't do that. Yet they demonize those people in our eyes. You know, Cuba's this and Cuba's that, Venezuela's this and Venezuela's that, you know. But when I went to Cuba, I talked to some young people, and it was I think it was a middle school or something, and 90% of the students was, you know, at a 90% level, you know. And I asked the question, I said, aren't you under stress, you know, being bombarded by the U.S. media saying we're going to destroy Cuba and Cuba this, aren't you? I said, because children in the U.S., you know, if you don't get them a pair of sneaks in Christmas, they'll jump off a bridge. You're not stressed, so stressed that you can't learn? They said, no, we don't. We love the American people. We just hate the American government. And their response was an expression of their love for the people. But the government, you know, will sacrifice the people before international solidarity is able to show, you know, that we got one world and we have to struggle against that. So I think a boycott will be extremely important, you know, in that regard. And I know others have some, but if I could just try to briefly, you know, see, again, we have to be proactive and not reactive. You know, all communities need to define what kind of jobs we want, what kind of jobs we don't want. It's not that we don't want jobs, but we want to define, you know, what type of jobs come in our community. You know, we don't want too much of this or too much of that, you know, because it creates an imbalance, maybe, you know, like Snow Hill said, you know, you got hogs, you got chickens, you got, you know, landfills, you got, you know, all kinds of stuff. We want to be able to have people's regulations. You know, we want to regulate our own communities, etc. That's one aspect of it. And we want to be able to have power, you know, to deal with, you know, those violations. On the question of poor whites, it's very, very important, and this is when we come to grips with an understanding of reforms. As long as people think that this system can be reformed, white supremacy and poor whites are going to feel, you understand, that I have a real chance and opportunity here. But when it becomes, how do we make clear that what is happening, you know, in the black and people of color community is the tip of the iceberg of a direction, you know, that's impacting larger and larger numbers of poor whites. And that's not going to be an easy job. You know, doing the New Deal program, you know, coming out of the economic crisis, and people talk about how important the New Deal was. It was important. But it also did not address the question of discrimination and racial, structural racism, you know, for black people, you know, in terms of jobs and community development and those kinds of things. It was important, it was needed, and I'm for it, you know, but let's not think that a strategy that's simply trying to repair or reform this system as opposed to empower the people to be able to dictate its direction, you know, will resolve that. And so we have to expect that there will probably be small layers of whites who will join this struggle. That's important. That's important so that among whites themselves, there's a leadership that's saying that our option for a humane society, you know, is to deeply involve ourselves in the struggle. But too often, oppressed peoples of color build solidarity by compromising on issues that deeply affect us, thinking that well, at least that expresses some solidarity. And what happens sometimes is when those issues are resolved, those deep issues that we compromised on will still be present. So it's going to take a struggle to do that. And we got some, you know, whites here. It may not be the poor sector, but we have some here. You know.
Give us a few more months.
That's right. So, I mean, that's just a thought.
Yeah, thank you, Saladin. So we are coming up on time, and the time is now 10:13. And I know that there are a lot of questions left in the audience, but I wanted to give Adam and Dee Dee an opportunity to offer any sort of closing remarks or final thoughts. And I know that everyone would be happy to discuss more about what the panelists spoke to after following the closing of the panel.
Yeah, thanks. I want to say thanks to everyone for engaging in this conversation and in this discussion and pushing us to think more broadly and more intently in the work that we're doing. And I mean, so I want to affirm a lot of what Saladin said, and agreeing on the strategies and tactics, and also thinking about when we talk about boycott, and also talking about and thinking about alternative structures, because I think it's difficult for lots of people to engage and participate in boycotts when they don't have any other options available. And thinking on a micro level, you know, when you live, you know, in a food desert or somewhere where you don't have produce or fresh vegetables, things like that available, and you want people to not shop at Walmart, which is, you know, Walmart is awful. There are no other options available in various communities, in these very poor, oppressed communities. Their only option is that Walmart. And so in thinking about boycott, and at the same time thinking about alternative structures that are being built to replace Walmart ultimately. Yeah, and I think there are like lots of people doing work around this question of the poor white people buffer. We have a student that works with us with Ignite NC, which is a fellowship program where we hire students and young people throughout the state of North Carolina to do the organizing work that they want to do on their campus and in their communities. And we have students at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, that is doing that kind of work, working with the community of Boone, which is extremely impoverished and lacking in resources, and having those conversations with the poor white community there, and specifically the mountain folks that are out there that's different and that has a different kind of language than just the country folk. And so it's like this constant question of what is it, what tactics and strategies go along with those communities that may be different from what happens in our community, and that we can't compromise on those strategies and those tactics for our end goal in the struggle. And so that's all I have. Thank you.
You know, in a lot of ways, what I have to say is echoing what has already been said. I think when it comes to something like a boycott, I think boycotts could be a temporary reprieve. It could be a temporary solution or a temporary tactic. But I think ultimately, like Dee Dee said, I think some level of autonomy, some level of self-production, it will be ultimately the only thing that can really address this issue of the hyper-capitalism, neoliberal moment that we're living through right now. And so I suppose that's what I have to say about that. As far as the coalition building, I mean, I think coalition building is the only way that any significant, real, radical change will come. But it takes, as Brother Muhammad said, it's going to take people realizing that there really is no alternative. There's nothing to be salvaged in this regime that we're living in, and I think that's a much harder conversation to have. Although, given I think our kind of economic and political moment, it's becoming clear that that is the case. So I think that it's going to take on the ground planning. It's an everyday project. It's not something that's going to come out of thin air. It's not any kind of bureaucracy or larger structure that's going to make that change. I think it has to be a person-to-person and then community-based project.
Great.
That's all I got.
Thanks.
Interesting comment. I want to make this point because I feel as though this panel and this discussion, basically, the viewpoints was we're playing the victim role. And I say this in the sense of what are we doing different over the course of all these years, going through slavery and going through a lot of different things dealing with oppression. What are we doing different now to incorporate more of the quote-unquote white or Caucasian intellect? What are we doing to incorporate them to make them want to participate? Why are we just settling for the little group? As you stated in your comment, why are we doing the same things? Over the course of history, we're still boycotting, we're still marching, we're still doing the same things, and we're getting the same results. What are we doing different? How can we better incorporate other races to our oppression and our, views on how we're being quote unquote treated? What are we doing different to incorporate these other races? We're still doing the same things from back in the day, and obviously it's not helping or changing anything. What can we do different? Can you shed light on any of that?
Well, first of all, I think, the question of whether the most oppressed have the absolute obligation, to incorporate the most oppressed, and I think history will show that we've continuously try to incorporate, integrate, and these things. You know, we have to also recognize that there's a system out there that's pulling another way. And so when we think about doing something different, we got to think about power relationships. We got to think about historical opportunities. You know, because, you know, sometimes we may not move timely on an issue. We may not frame an issue and a demand in a way, you know, that it can be seen more widely. And I think we got to look at some of those questions. And I think finally, we haven't done the same thing continuously throughout history. There's been different tactics, a variety of tendencies. You had integration, you had separation, you had autonomous. I mean, you know, so again, I think we have to really look at history and to really find out the lessons of history. You know, when, you know, you know, this system is overextended. It's in wars every place. In wars every place. But why is it in our time to intensify the struggle here while it's overextended, trying to oppress people everywhere? You know, we have to figure that out. But sometimes we don't want to do that because we're characterized as being anti-American. That's what happened during World War II, right after the Depression, where it says, you know, if you really fight, you understand, for more wages and fight for power now, and if you really fight against the racist system in the South, this is going to hurt us when we claim to be fighting against fascism abroad. This is going to make us look like we're hypocritical. And so people say, well, I'm going to, you know, protect America and do that. So I think we got to study history a little bit more and study it together, because sometimes when we study it by ourselves and don't have any, you know, interaction with people, we may just see it more narrowly than we otherwise would.
All right, thanks, y'all. I'm sorry we can't take any more questions right now.
And can we have a second round of applause for our facilitator who did a fabulous job?